I'm going to be talking about something which is very exciting and offbeat path. So I'm very happy to welcome all of you to our session on entrepreneurship. We have a very uh, great set of speakers to talk about this off-beaten path. But before we start, let me start off with a short quiz. What do you think is common here? These are products we use in our day-to-day life. There's Gmail from Google, there's a Facebook Live button, and there's Post-it notes. So please go ahead and share your thoughts in the chat session, and I'll look at them. Hopefully that gets your juices running as to what do you think is common between all of these day-to-day products. Great, thanks for your comments. Yeah, so some of you got this correct, right? All of these products were built by employees within an established organization without any mandate from the top. As you know, Gmail was formulated and conceived during the 20% time that Google allocates to its employees. Likewise, Facebook Live was conceived during one of the hackathons, and 3M Post-it notes was also an outcome of internal innovation. So as you can see, all of these products have been impactful and have made a huge impact for everyone in this world. And this is an outcome of what we call as entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is actually a very relatively new term. It came into being, or it came more into common vernacular around the mid 1980s. So it's been around only for about 4 decades. Entrepreneurship, as you can imagine, is the act of behaving like an entrepreneur. But the key difference is it is while you're working within an established organization. So the motives and the rewards are similar, but it is within an organization. If you look at it from a firm's point of view, it is the practice of corporate management style that integrates risk-taking with innovation approaches. And it also uses the similar reward and motivational techniques. So what leads us to focus on entrepreneurship as a topic during this IIT2020 event? One of the common themes about IIT 2020 is how we as individuals can make an impact because of where we are in the future. So ultimately, all entrepreneurs are in it for one important reason, just like entrepreneurs. They want to improve the world and drive progress, right? And so our hope as we put together this panel is, as you hear their stories, you will think about how we can enable employees to become more entrepreneurial global citizens within established corporations and help solve the biggest problems affecting humanity. That is the goal of putting together this globally diverse panel. And we hope that by looking and hearing all the speakers, you get a very diverse perspective as to how other people have worked through these problems within companies and what are the challenges as you also look to make positive impact using your corporation's resources. Without further delay, let me introduce the speakers who will go and share their best practices and their success stories. So first of all, it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Janjit Bhattacharya from India. I know it's a difficult time zone for Janjit, so I really appreciate him joining us. So Dr. Janjit is an expert on technology policy and in technology-driven government and societal transformation. He is the president of Center of Digital Economic Policy Research and founder of Zero on Microsystems, a fintech firm. He is the former head of Center of Fourth Industrial Revolution India, World Economic Forum, and former head and partner of Economic and Policy Practice, KPMG. He was also a recipient of APJ Abdul Kalam Award for Innovation in Governance. Bhattacharya is an adjunct professor at Department of Management Studies, IIT, and he is also a member of the Governing Society of IIT Raipur. He received his PhD from Department of Computer Science and Engineering at IIT Delhi, MBA from IIM Cal, and BTech in Electrical Engineering from IIT Kanpur. Dr. Janjit will be followed.
Thank you, Rohit. Thanks for the wonderful introduction, and that's quite embarrassing. And I hope people do get a diverse views of what we have to say and not a confusing set of views. So I have a little deck and a presentation which I'll like to share, and I'll just go ahead and share my screen. I hope you can see my screen in a slide share mode.
Yes.
Okay, so great. I'll be talking about entrepreneurship from an Indian perspective. And let me start off by actually talking about a little differentiator in terms of entrepreneurship, where one, in my view, entrepreneur is where the company is the incubator, and sometimes the company is also the VC, and that's how they become the entrepreneur. And then that leads to either new businesses getting created within the company, or it leads to new businesses getting created outside of the company. And that's normally what the outcome of an entrepreneur venture is. And if you look at it from an Indian perspective, I just put three poster boys out there of entrepreneurial ventures. If you look at Tata's, they are a salt to steel behemoth. And why do we have so many of Indian conglomerates having entrepreneurship and having so many range of products out there and of business interests? And that's basically because they're operating in a high risk environment, and therefore entrepreneurial venture comes quite naturally, because if you are focused on one single venture and in a high risk ecosystem, if that venture does not succeed, the entire group goes down. And therefore, from an Indian perspective, which is a traditionally higher risk environment, you will see that there are a large set of conglomerates getting into entrepreneurial ventures, which then leads to more value coming out. Tata's were obviously famous for coming out with a 1 lakh rupee car, but they also came out with one of the most valuable IT companies globally, which was TCS. In fact, 1968, it was more of an internal department. And then as part of the entrepreneurial venture, FC Kohli went ahead and created a new company out of that little department. And in fact, I was lucky to have FC Kohli actually write the foreword of one of my books. But that was a venture of Tata's. But if you go to Wipro's, they started off as a vegetable oil company seller. And from there, they have spun off as a venture which is into lighting, a venture which is into digital, into IT, and so on and so forth. And that brings me to Reliance, where they have actually very recently come out with the world's biggest startup in terms of digital and in terms of marketing, of markets, of retail. So a petroleum company started off internal ventures into telecom, and then into digital, and then into retail. And while we were all locked down, they came out with a combined valuation of their startups of over $100 billion. And that is the kind of entrepreneurial activity that's going on in India. And it's absolutely fabulous to track what's going on. And these are just some of the few examples out there. There's clearly not everything that's happening. So it's a very exciting journey that we're having in India over here. So going back to some of the basic questions as to why do we have entrepreneurship? One, because there's a business need. The world is changing. If Wipro was still selling vegetable oils, do you think their valuation will be what it is right now? But Wipro stands for vegetable oil producing company. And therefore, you need to see where the world is going, where the markets are. And that's where an entrepreneurial venture does what is typically captured in the Indian societal modes where we destruct in order to construct. It also acts as a business reconnaissance tool that does a new market segment really make sense or it doesn't make sense? Can we get a bunch of people within the company to go out and check, build something and test the market and see if there's really a business model or if there is a technology model to actually serve the business model? So it acts as a good reconnaissance tool. It also has reduced cost of actually doing an entrepreneurial venture. Instead of doing it outside, you do an entrepreneurial venture because the costs are lower. You don't need to pay for an HR separately, for accounting separately, marketing, sales, channels, distribution. The bunch of that cost gets reduced significantly because it is within the organization, which also leads to reduced risk. If you are spending less, then the risks are much lower. And that's what pushing companies to actually promote entrepreneurship. And that also leads to a better chance of survival because you have the ecosystem in place, you have the connects in place, you've got access to the market. And that also leads to disrupting oneself before the world really disrupts you. Unfortunately, I haven't really seen too many entrepreneurial venture which actually disrupts a parent company, but that should be one of the focus areas. In fact, I have been in initiatives where we were close to disrupting the parent organization's initiative and existing business, and that did not really work out. And those are some of the things I'll cover in the next 5-6 minutes. It also helps in keeping alive the entrepreneurial venture within the entrepreneurial culture in the organization. And as you said, Rohit, earlier, that this is a very old concept. In fact, here is a Time magazine clipping I've put out there of 1985, which clearly shows that entrepreneurship has become very mature by 1985. So what does a traditional Indian entrepreneur look like, or an entrepreneur look like? Well, we used to have the family ventures, the big family businesses where the uncle, the grandfather, the aunt, the cousin, everybody is doing some business. They were one of the first ones to help out in the entrepreneurial ventures. They became your advisory board. They pushed you to start up something. They pushed you to, they became your incubator. They became your venture funder. They became your market access because you would end up selling to your cousin or your uncle or your aunt or grandfather or somebody in that big, huge family network. So there is a deep, rich tradition of entrepreneurship where instead of the company, there used to be a family entrepreneurship. And if you're not following what your parents' business is, then you will be pushed into creating a new business depending on what the new market segments are. So there is actually a rich tradition of entrepreneurship in India. And I'm talking from a vantage point of actually rolling out a whole bunch of successful entrepreneurship in multiple companies and in the military, where we actually rolled out a Gaussian knocksock for the military, which could be transported. So I can vouch for the fact that it works in India. But there are also many challenges. And I was lucky that most of these are successful because there was a lot of backup from the top management. There's complete support from the top management. But in spite of that, there will be and will always be existing structures which push you back. The organization has been constructed in a particular manner, which is not really conducive of the changes that an entrepreneurial venture will bring in. There are quarterly pressures. You can't just take away a resource from the organization, but the resource is focused on the targets being laid out for that particular quarter, and expect that the resource will be aligned to the kind of entrepreneurial venture that you're doing. There'll be market space conflicts. There'll be budget pressures. And in the interest of time, I'm just not going into the details of it. There'll be conflicts with communication to existing customers. And imagine you go to the existing customer whom you're selling vegetable oil and then say, well, I'm now going to do the digital transformation for you. Well, that doesn't really work. There are two different brands out there. And that leads to the structure of the organization also to be changed significantly. You can't have, for example, a partnership company coming in and backing up your entrepreneurial venture, because by the time that starts paying off, some of the partners would have retired. So you cannot have some of the structures of the organization actually prohibits you from getting into entrepreneurial ventures. And those are challenges. And therefore, some of the mantras followed are do nothing and nothing will go wrong within an organization. And that's a pushback that you get, because there are people within the organization who would not like to get into the collateral damage that might happen because of your entrepreneurial venture. And therefore, the trick is to find adjacencies instead of disruptions within an organization to be really successful. Again, there is no one rule, but that's something that I'm just putting out there. There's also deep fear and anger of loss that might happen. If there's a financial loss, there will be others who will be taking the hit for that. If there's a market loss, there is a accountability that is out there, and an organization has been built for accountability. So you suddenly cannot say that, well, I don't really care about financial losses and market losses or reputational losses, because as a startup, you will not have a full product. You will have what is typically called an MVP, a minimum viable product. You can't go out with a minimal viable product and play around with the brand name of an established company. That is anathema. There's reputation loss of the professionals, there's loss of privileges. These professionals will not be allowed to take another bet in the near future. That's the nature of the company. And so there is loss of future opportunities that will be coming in. And that's very challenging. And I'm just taking a quick example of the Kodak moment, where one of the engineers of Kodak, Steve Sasson, went ahead and built the digital camera in 1970. There was fear and anger against what he had built up, because the shareholders had actually paid or actually invested into Kodak to make sure that Kodak is able to sell films based on the cameras that they sell, pretty much like a Gillette model, where you sell the blades because you've sold the razor, or like a HP model where you sell the print cartridges because you've sold the printer. But imagine somebody coming and saying, well, you don't need to sell blades anymore because I'll make a bladeless razor, or you don't need to sell any more ink cartridges because I've made a printer which doesn't need your ink cartridges. That's anathema. That's angering the organization. That's exactly what happened with Kodak. We know what was the outcome of it. I mean, it's a classic poster boy example of how you should not be treating entrepreneurship. And that's just, is well summarized in the saying from Gita, which says, from anger comes delusion, from delusion, the loss of memory, from loss of memory, the destruction of wisdom. And destruction of wisdom leads to perishing, which is exactly what happened in the Kodak situation. And that was a Kodak moment. So entrepreneurship and ignoring of entrepreneurship has a lot of challenges. The other quick point around entrepreneurship is a market permission. You can't play around with a brand. Brand conflict hence needs a different brand. For example, if you're selling vegetable oils, you suddenly can't go and say, now I'll be selling you IT. And therefore, there's a need to protect existing brand. There's need, therefore, to create possibly a new brand to support the entrepreneurship, which actually requires more investment. And it might be an issue of ultraviolet in that sense. And I think it could be well summarized in a bit of a parody from the Boyzone song, that brand is all I have to take your market away. And if you mess around with the brand, you actually mess around with the parent company. So it becomes quite a challenge to come out with new such solutions. Now, entrepreneurship is not limited to companies alone. If you look at the Sri Lankan Navy, they were facing the issue of LTT terrorists coming and banging their small boats full of explosives against a large ship. So they had to figure out one way of solving it. And they formed a small entrepreneurial team which came out with a solution that, well, we'll not use the big ships. We'll also use the small ships. And they end up having 20, 30 small ships being around, or small boats being around, which solved the problem of not being rammed by the LTT terrorist boats. And those were entrepreneurial ventures within the military. Similarly, there has been entrepreneurial ventures within the Indian government, where the government came out with a government e-marketplace, like an Amazon. It was a government Amazon. And it has completely transformed the way that the government is procuring. In fact, there are talks that they will actually turn it into a private sector marketplace also. Similarly, a national agricultural marketplace, completely transformational for India. The unified payment systems, where it has suddenly become one of the largest payment platforms in the world, where more than 1.5 billion transactions happening on a monthly basis. And it connects everybody's account to everybody's account, and I can just press a button and make a payment. It's absolutely smooth, done by the patronage of the government, by creating small different organizations where entrepreneurs took it up and turned it into a very successful venture. And if you're talking about India, we must talk about cows. That's important. We actually had cows going online for sale, and this was done for the first time almost 20 years ago by somebody from IIT Kanpur, a gentleman named Amit Agarwal, who actually sold a cow on the net almost 20 years back. And those are entrepreneurial ventures that the government actually supported. And since we, quite a few of us are from IITs and there's IIT 2020, I must talk about the entrepreneurial ventures within the IITs. After 60 years of just ramming in engineering education, they're actually coming out with medical education. We all know the challenges of coming out with new institutional structures within an old archaic institutional structure. And that's what both IIT Kharagpur, IIT Kanpur, they've all been doing, and putting up super specialty hospitals, medical education, which is indeed quite awesome in that sense. I couldn't believe that IITs could do that. And that is really an excellent entrepreneurial venture that the IITs have done. Just coming to the end of my little conversation, I think the phases of entrepreneurship is well summarized by what Mahatma Gandhi said, is first they ignore you within the organization. And if you persist, then they laugh at you. If you still persist, then they fight you. And if you still persist at the end of it, then you win, and that's when they embrace you. So thank you, Rohit, for the opportunity, and thank you to IIT 2020.
Thank you, Janjit. That was so awesome. I loved your example of selling a cow on the internet. That's like really cool. So I had one question, which came up on the chat room as well. So how do you view entrepreneurship different in India versus US? Can you spend like a couple of minutes to talk about that?
Sure, Rohit. As I mentioned, US has this mantra of focusing on the core competency. So if you are a camera company, you should do nothing else but cameras. And that works because you can become the top dog in the camera industry in a stable economic environment. In India, if you focus on one single core activity, it is quite possible that the core activity may just vanish. We have entire business houses that vanish because of nationalization of aircraft manufacturing, of shipbuilding, of even airline services, and so on and so forth. So naturally, in India, it is easier to have entrepreneurial ventures which are not frowned upon, and you're not really threatening anyone because that's the nature of business. You need to have a diversified set of businesses within the Indian ecosystem so that you can survive. And that may not be that much more acceptable in US, where if you are in a digital company, you can't go ahead and say, well, I'm now going to make vegetable oils because I can do it in a much cooler way. Well, that will not possibly be that easier to get accepted.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you. So if your company doesn't have an entrepreneurial effort, how do you convince the management to devote money and resources to make that happen?
No, that is the whole challenge of entrepreneurship. If you're not adding value, then you will not get support from either within the company or from outside. So if you were a regular startup and you did not really add value anywhere, you will not be getting the support that you're looking for. And that holds true in an entrepreneurial venture also. If you're not adding value to either the corporation or to the people or to the market space, then clearly it'll be a challenge trying to get that support. I think Sumit articulated that very well in terms of the market permissions and the corporate permissions, and what the entrepreneurial venture needs to be is to be aligned to the market permissions and the corporate permissions, Rohit.
Okay.
And my experience on this, Rohit, has been that if you can get to senior management in a company, they are actually looking for entrepreneurial ideas. So I know that's hard if you're a junior person in the company to be able to access that. But most senior leadership is actually very interested in encouraging this. And so, frankly, it's a little bit of luck, a little bit of, it's like any, if you're like
Julia and I both try to get or have been formally trained as part of this lead corporate innovation at Stanford Business School for a couple of years as to how to actually set up a process and how to get buy-in from management on this. So anyway, so thanks so much. I know we're out of time. I really appreciate the speakers. They put in a lot of effort to put together slides and participate in Q&A. And feel free to connect with each and every one of us after this session. If you need any more insights or advice as to how each of us took the step in this space, we'll be thrilled to share that with you. A big round of applause to the speakers, and thank you for the good questions that came over the chat. Thank you.
Thank you.